think to be a Sri Lankan, even to be a privileged Sri Lankan, is to really have to grapple with migration and how different kinds of migrant experiences have impacted different kinds of people in Sri Lanka. My name is Tanu Yakupitiage, also known as DJ Ushka. I'm also an immigrant rights organizer in New York City.
And joining us this afternoon is Thanu Yakupitiage. She is the Communications and Special Projects Coordinator for the New York Immigration Coalition.
So we, the community-based organizations that we work with represent all of the different communities, and the New York Immigration Coalition sort of exists to be a political vehicle for everyone to work together, because otherwise you're in your silos and you're dealing with your different populations. So we have groups who work specifically with Arab and Muslim communities, groups that work with South Asian communities, groups that work with Korean and Chinese communities, African communities, Polish and Eastern European communities, Caribbean, Haitian. So it's really all of us together where we're trying to make a difference to the lives of all immigrants, and really to make a statement that, you know, immigrants really are a fabric of America and a fabric of New York.
And I run a party called Ibomba with a friend of mine called Beto. I'm involved in a crew of artists, particularly musicians and DJs called Dirty Arts. And a lot of us were basically interested in global electronic music. And when I say global music, I don't mean like Putumayo type cities. I mean like very much like sort of migrant music. And that's like much more easily facilitated these days because of sort of music that's produced on the internet. I don't think that I necessarily considered myself an artist until maybe more recently, but you know, I've always been a writer, and I've always been a dancer, and my sort of musical endeavors as a DJ really started around 2010 when I was finishing grad school, and you know, I just wanted to be involved in or have an artistic practice that was mine, particularly because at the time I was also struggling with my own immigration status in the States, and because I liked dancing, and it really was freeing. It was like a sort of a healing means for me. And yeah, I started DJing sort of publicly in 2011, and I've been doing it ever since. And you know, at the time there weren't that many women of color DJs, particularly within like a global electronic music scene or an electronic music scene. So, I mean, it was sort of well received, which was great. And since then, there's been like a lot more queer women and gender non-conforming folks doing music, and so it's really good to see that a lot more people are doing that. I do all of this work around migration and immigrant rights. In the US, I sort of see it as connected. You know, I myself am an immigrant. I'm Sri Lankan of Sinhalese background, but I grew up mainly in Thailand, a little bit in the UK, and I moved to the States when I was 18. Sort of connected a lot of my artistic work to migration, and also as an immigrant in the States, like I firsthand have experienced how hard it is to stay. And you know, I've been on multiple visas. I've basically been on different visas in the US since 2003. I'm only just about to get my green card, like 13 years later. And so, you know, obviously I've not been undocumented, but I think that there is a sense of understanding for me, and therefore a sense of solidarity with folks in the States who are undocumented. But also my experience has really has made me really want to support and be an ally to folks who have been refugees and who have had to migrate because of, you know, much worse circumstances than I, you know, or my family had to migrate. You know, at the same time, I also recognize my privilege. You know, like I'm Sinhalese and I'm Buddhist, and Sinhalese people are not the ones who left Sri Lanka for any, you know, for reasons of war. You know, there's very particular kinds of caste and ethnicity relationships in regards to migration. My own trajectory of immigrating was my father getting a full scholarship to a PhD program in Scotland, and that's how we left. Like we left because of, you know, academic possibilities and achievements of my father, you know, and I want to be very clear about that. I do think though that coming from an island that has such a contentious history and has since you know the British colonization or since we got independence has really wrestled with what it means to be a nation state and what it means to be a place of people of different ethnicities, and has not done it well, and has, you know, and there's a state and a government that has oppressed minority groups, you know, and people have left in all sorts of ways. So you have people, you know, particularly Tamil Lankans who left because of the war. You know, you have women who've left because of, you know, sexual assault and other types of sexual abuse. There's a whole host of factors, and you also have people who have left because like there were better academic or, you know, educational opportunities or employment opportunities elsewhere. People aren't treated well, you know, like if you're Tamil, if you're Muslim, if you're queer, like there is no space necessarily in a civil society that's trying to dictate itself by this idea of like a Sinhala Buddhist state. Like where is there space for people who do not fit into this particular narrative that a government is trying to set for an entire nation, right? And so I think that it's all of our responsibilities, including Sinhala and Buddhist people, in order to really interrogate that stuff and to really break out of the state sort of these very like stringent state boundaries that are actually like oppressing like a lot of people within, whether it be in Sri Lanka or whether it be like in the States. Sri Lankan diaspora, it really depends on who you're speaking to, because I think that Sri Lanka as like a nation state concept doesn't necessarily like fit with a lot of people, and because there's so many different kinds of Sri Lankans, and some people don't even identify as Sri Lankan, but they might be from the island, you know. I think it depends. I'm not necessarily part of a Sri Lankan diaspora in the West, because like the majority of my community is not Sri Lankan, and the majority of my Sri Lankan community is a mixed ethnicity, mixed gender, mixed sexuality community, you know, and a much more sort of a queer Lankan community. But from what I've seen, you know, I mean, it depends on where you go. Like, so for example, in New York, if you go to Staten Island, there's like a very distinct Sinhala community. There's a distinct Tamil community. If you go to Edison, New Jersey, it's the same thing. If you go to Toronto, it's a majority Tamil community, and not all of them identify as Sri Lankan. They identify as from Elam. You have other big pockets of Sri Lankans in London. There's both Sinhala and Tamil and Muslim communities in Australia, the same thing. And you know, some of these communities, I think maybe the younger communities mix a little bit more in terms of ethnicity. The older communities, I think, do not as much. Well, I think the Sri Lankan diaspora still has to sort of reconcile with the Civil War, you know? Like, the Civil War ended, kind of, sort of. The Civil War ended in, what, 2007?
2009.
2009. The Civil War ended in 2009, and yet just 2 weeks ago, 2 Tamil students were killed at the University of Jaffna.
பணங்கொக்குவில் குளப்பட்டி சந்தையில் வைத்து கடந்த 21ஆம் திகதி வியாழக்கிழமை இரவு 11:30 அளவில் மோட்டார் சைக்கிளில் அவர்களான 24 வயதுடைய விஜயகுமார் சுலக்சன் மற்றும் 23 வயதான நடராசா கஜன் ஆகியோர் போலீசாரால் சுட்டுக் கொல்லப்பட்டனர். முதலில் இந்த கொலையை விபத்தென கூறிய போலீசார்,
Like, if Tamil and Sinhala communities are not talking to each other, like, the first questions you have to ask is like in coming to places like the States or Canada, like what are you running away from, and like, or like what have you left behind, and also like how can we as communities in the diaspora like reconcile in order to support this island that we're all a part of together, you know? Because like if we're still in a situation where, you know, like nationalist Sinhalese people are like sending money to like Buddhist nationalists, and like, you know, more like Elam supporters are sending money to like the Tamil Tiger support. You know, it's like, and I have no real critique of folks, particularly like Tamil folks doing that. Like, that's not my place to say, but like there's so much tensions within our communities. It's not one cohesive community. And so I think even before we talk about like who we are in the States, we have to reconcile like who we are to each other. Sri Lankans on the island think that people in the diaspora don't fully understand what's happening on the island. And there's some truth to it, but there's also a lot of like falsity to it. So like the Sinhala Buddhist nationalist narrative, particularly perpetuated by Mahinda Rajapaksa, is that we need to stop listening to these like Western, like diasporic Sri Lankans, because this is just a form of colonization, and they're just trying to tell us Sri Lankans on the island like how we should run our country. And I actually like really disagree with that, because I think Mahinda Rajapaksa is a dictator and an asshole. I think Mahinda Rajapaksa, but and I think on the diaspora side, there's definitely, I think there is a guilt, like probably, of like who you've left behind, and so like, folks are constantly sending money back for like, different sort of reasons, right? And then I think, there's also like perhaps an anger on the part of, I think, Tamil Lankans who are on the island, of being like, well, we stayed, like you left, we stayed. You didn't have to deal with like what we dealt with at the end of the war, yeah, but so I think it depends on, again, it depends on what kind of Sri Lankan you are and what your ethnicity and background is, but there is a sense in Sri Lanka that like folks in the diaspora, like they don't really know what's happening on the island, like, and it's a complicated thing, because like, even when I like try to like argue with my father or like some of my relatives, when I talk about Sri Lankan politics, they'll be like, oh, well, you're not really Sri Lankan anyway, you barely lived here, you don't know what's going on. You were just like all of the other people outside of the island who keep trying to insert themselves, but you don't really know what's going on, and you're not moving back anywhere, so why do you care? So that's like sort of the narrative on the island. I mean, I think that it's like very complicated. I don't think that the critique of the diaspora is like valid. I think that like what Sri Lanka, the government of Sri Lanka needs to understand that they need to embrace all Sri Lankans, including people in the diaspora. Like in India, if you are an Indian who lives outside of India, you can get non-resident Indian status. They call them NRIs. Like they should do the same for Sri Lanka. There's so many Sri Lankans, like Tamil and Sinhalese people outside of and Muslims and Burghers, who outside of Sri Lanka could be a great influence and support for Sri Lanka. But Sri Lanka is like, but the state is like trying to like ostracize them. They're depending on sort of your relationship to the Tigers, for example, during the war, like you may not be able to come back to Sri Lanka, and so, and I think that perpetuates this anger within parts of the diaspora, where like this oppressive state is like continuing to not let them go back to their homelands. However, one of the main things about the 1965 Immigration Act was that you had to be a high-skilled worker. And so what was happening was that, particularly from South Asia, from India, from Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Pakistan, the folks who were moving to the States were, the doctors and the people who ended up being academics and professors. That was sort of the class of people that they wanted in the States. And I think that really sort of helped to solidify the model minority myth, because they were essentially saying, oh, okay, well, these Asians, we're going to let them in because they have these skills, right? And it's interesting when you compare the 1965 Immigration Act to sort of the work of the civil rights movement, because really, if it wasn't for the civil rights movement and the struggle of Black people, there would not have been a space in the United States for Asian people, for people from other parts of the world, and yet there's a way in which sort of immigrants, particularly these model minority immigrants, came in and were sort of pit against Black communities, even though it was the struggle of Black communities that really like allowed Asian communities to thrive. We're sort of in an era of migration where, there's some folks who are second generation, third generation, fourth generation even South Asians, and then there are folks who will constantly be new to a country, and I think that for those who are entering new, if migration continues to be from like the east and the south to the west, it will always be like a needing to quote unquote better yourself, and you do that by getting like these like more high profile jobs, or aspiring to that, right? But I think for people who are more second generation and third generation, there is more of a subversion of those model minority myths. Another thing to note is that, so like the immigrants who came in after 1965, based on the 1965 Immigration Act, were like had a little bit of a higher level of education. But you know, immigrants coming in now, you know, you can see this especially with like the Bangladeshi community. Like they're not necessarily like upper caste, like upper class immigrants, and so there's even like within those who came to the US earlier, like in the 60s and 70s, versus those coming in now, there's a class difference. And so obviously for those coming in now who maybe have, you know, are like working as cab drivers or running a bodega or whatever, like what they want for their children is to be more than just that, you know, not that there's anything wrong with that, but they're aspiring for their kids to be more than that. Where do I see myself in that? So my parents don't live in the States, like they don't live in the West. My father is a professor in Thailand. My mother is a chemistry teacher in Sri Lanka. Like certainly growing up in both Thailand and in Sri Lanka, we were told like, oh, well, why don't you be a biochemist, or why don't you be a computer scientist or whatnot. But we didn't feel much pressure in terms of like the jobs that we chose. But you know, at the same time, like, you know, I might be an artist, but like that's not my full-time job. Like you know, my parents respect me perhaps because I have a policy job, you know. I took my passion around immigration, but like I do writing around it, and I do like sort of policy work, and they don't even know I'm a DJ actually. Like I just like didn't tell them about that part. So it's like funny because it's actually like a huge part of my life, but my parents don't know. And it's not even because I'm scared, it's just because like we actually already are so distant in terms of, you know, there's like so many oceans between us. Like I was just like, this is irrelevant. Like this is like, they're just gonna be like, oh, that's a cute hobby, so why tell them about my hobby? I'm sure my father has Googled it and like seen, but he doesn't say anything about it. And so I've never said to him that I'm a DJ. And maybe that speaks more to like my mentality, because maybe in my head I think that my parents aren't gonna respect it, so I've never said anything to them. I mean, arts and culture can be a really important healing mechanism and tool. You know, my friend Yalini Dream, who I'm assuming you're talking to, like she's a really good example of that. She's someone who uses theater and dance and music to really, and poetry to really talk about, you know, her own experience as a Catholic Tamil from Jaffna, who grew up in Texas, you know, and she I mean, I would say every couple of years like goes to Jaffna and like does like workshops with, you know, youth. And so I think that arts and culture can be a really great way of like bringing all of our communities together and really like reconciling and talking about all of these things. And when I say reconcile, I don't mean like, okay, we just need to like forget the past and forget the wounds of this war and like move on. I actually mean like really like acknowledging, like having communities come together to acknowledge their privileges and acknowledge like how it is that they want to work together